In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the rise of the Atlantic traders, in particular the consequence of this rise for the populations in the New World and the Old World. One question that economic historians think about when they think about international trade is whether particular episodes constitute globalisation. Economic historians tend to think about globalisation in terms of markets becoming more integrated. In this period, it turns out that there's not a lot of evidence that markets did become more integrated. It doesn't seem that the prices that goods were selling at in different markets converged, nor does it seem that there was a major structural change in the prices of labour or land around the world. At the same time, the rate at which Europe's trade with the rest of the world grew was nowhere near as quick as it would be in future episodes. So in this table here, I've got the percentage growth in Europe's trade with the rest of the world for various periods from 1500 onwards, and you can see that the period we're talking about as the rise of the Atlantic traders, the rates of growth in trade per year were smaller than would be the case subsequently in the period after 1820s, which we'll talk about in a couple of lectures' time. You also have to remember that, of course, this Atlantic trade was only a small part of total global trade at the time. For example, there was the Baltic trade through the Netherlands and Mediterranean trade, which constituted major portions of world trade. Nevertheless, I think it is possible to argue that the rise of the Atlantic traders constitutes a major episode in the history of economic development. This is often summarised through an idea called the Columbian Exchange. The idea that the rise of the Atlantic traders had major effects both on populations, well-being of the New World and the Old World countries. One point was that the rise of the Atlantic traders increased significantly the availability of silver in the New World. So this came about basically by European countries expropriating silver from, for example, the Americas. So silver mines in Peru where silver was mined, often using forced labour from the indigenous population and then taken back to Europe. This silver was extremely important in promoting trade. So this quote from Ron Finlay and Kevin O'Rourke, they say that the increased availability in silver from the rise of the Atlantic traders had the basic function of increasing intra-Eurasian trade. So silver was used as a form of money, and so the more silver you had, the more of this good you had, which could be used to facilitate monetary or monetised trade and exchange. This graph shows the amount of silver that was taken from the Americas, different periods of time from the early 16th century through to the late 18th century. And you can see that basically the amount that was taken increases steadily across time. Now, that total amount is split into two parts, European imports and European exports. European imports is the amount of that silver that came to America. European exports is the amount of silver that Europe then used to pay for goods and services they were buying in their trade with other parts of the world. And so you can see that a substantial amount of silver is being used by Europe in their trade with other parts of the world, but a substantial amount of the silver is also being used by Europe to facilitate trade within Europe. So silver was taken from the Americas by the Europeans, and its increased availability really acted as a basis for facilitating an increase in trade, both internationally and within European markets. Second major impact of the Columbian Exchange was on the variety of foodstuffs available in Europe. So through their travel to the Americas and to Asia, the Europeans became aware of a variety of foodstuffs which were suitable for growing or consuming in Europe. One example is the potato. So the potato turns out to have high nutrition value. The potato also provides a very high level of energy per acre planted with potatoes. One study by the Harvard economic historian Nathan Nunn has concluded that about 1/5 of the population growth in Europe between 1700 and 1900 compared to the 700 years before that can be explained by the introduction of the potato, and that about 45 to 50% of the growth in urbanisation in Europe during this period can be explained by the introduction of the potato. Other new foodstuffs that came from Americas were, for example, capsicums, tomatoes, cocoa, and of course there was tobacco as well. Other exceptionally important foodstuffs or commodities were sugar, tea and coffee. So the development of sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean meant that there could be a large increase in the supply of sugar to Europe. Similarly, increasing trade with China increased the amount of tea that was available in European markets. This caused there to be a decrease in the price of both sugar and tea during this period, so the increased supplier availability allowed the price of these commodities to decrease, and they moved from being luxuries to being commodities that were generally consumed in the population. So that you can see from the 1670s through to the late 18th century, the consumption of sugar per person in England increases more than tenfold. The amount of coffee is increasing at all, and the amount of tea is increasing substantially also. So through this trade with the New World, Europe was able to vastly expand the range of foodstuffs it had available. I've talked about how that is likely to have had some effect on population growth and urbanisation, but as well, if we think about the effect of having commodities like sugar, coffee and tea, two economists, Jonathan Hirsch and Hans Joachim Voth, have estimated that the availability of commodity sugar, tea, coffee actually increased well-being in England during this period by about 15%. There were also significant effects on indigenous populations from European contact. One effect was spread of diseases. So this quote from Nathan Nunn and Nancy Quien points out that Europeans brought deadly viruses and bacteria such as smallpox, measles, typhus and cholera, for which Native Americans had no immunity. And so during this period, there were very high death rates amongst, for example, American indigenous population from having these diseases brought to the Americas by European populations. Another major impact was the introduction of slavery, associated in particular with the production of sugar. So this quote from Sidney Mintz says that sugar, or rather the great commodity market which arose demanding it, has been one of the massive demographic forces in world history. Because of it, literally millions of enslaved Africans reached the New World. What Mintz is pointing out there is the fact that when Europeans decided to promote the growing of sugar in Brazil and in the Caribbean in particular, they didn't use labour from Europe. Instead, they used enslaved labour from Africa. And so the production of this commodity of sugar in Brazil and the Caribbean, which was then transported to Europe, was largely underpinned by slave labour from Africa, transported from Africa to those locations. This is an example of a sugar plantation at the time from the St. Croix Virgin Islands. Why was slavery used as the method for obtaining labour for these sugar plantations? Well, I think there's a general answer and a specific answer. The general answer is nicely summarised in this quote by Nayant Chanda, that people's insatiable search for wealth and drive for profit and the importance of human power as a source of energy, combined with power imbalances between human communities, led to the growth of a system that reached its peak, the slave system, in the early 19th century and has since profoundly altered human civilization. And I think there's three sort of important parts of this quote. One is the thing that underpinned slavery was the economic activity of sugar production, that the sugar producers, plantation owners, were trying to make money from this production activity. So it was underpinned by the drive for profit. Secondly, this production activity required large amounts of labour, human power to drive it. And so there was labour needed. And thirdly, where was that labour going to come from? Well, for a reason I'll mention in a minute, it was unlikely to come from Europe. Instead, it had to be obtained from somewhere else. And power imbalances, the military technology advantage that Europe had over, for example, Africa, meant that the labour could be forcibly taken from Africa to work on the plantations. I think there's also two more specific answers to why slavery in, for example, the Caribbean and Brazil. One is that the disease environment in, for example, the Caribbean caused huge death rates amongst anyone there. And so European settlers there had such high death rates that no European settlers wanted to go to work there as labourers, or if they did, they would have had to be paid such prohibitively high wages. One British migrant to Jamaica described it as sickly as a hospital and as dangerous as the plague. 2/3 of the first 1,000 British settlers on Jamaica had died within 2 months. So the disease environment meant that Europeans weren't going to go there to work. There was going to have to be labour found from somewhere else, and because of the power imbalance, that labour could forcibly be taken from Africa. The other reason why slavery was adopted as a method of finding labour for the sugar plantations, I think, is more economic, and it's an idea called the Domar hypothesis, named after an economic historian, Evsey Domar. Domar's hypothesis was that there are three things in an agricultural economy that you can never have together: free land, free peasants, and non-working landowners. By non-working landowners, he meant sort of a rentier class, a group of landowners who would live off their land by having other people work the land for them. And what Domar was saying is that if you want to have a group of landowners who are in effect sort of a rentier class, you can't have free land and free peasants or free labour with that. Because if you have free land, then labour is always going to see it as a great opportunity to move out and take up that land itself. And so that means that if you're a landowner, you're going to have to pay a relatively high wage in order for the labour to be willing to come to work for you, rather than being willing to, rather than wanting to go out and take up its own land, farm the land itself. So if you've got free land and free labour, it's going to be very expensive for the landowning class to hire workers in order to work their land. So instead, if you have free land, as you did from the point of view of the Europeans during this period, then you really needed a system where labour was not free. You needed some way in which you could pay much less for labour than you would if there was free labour. And so slavery was one way of obtaining labour that wasn't free, where you could keep down the cost of having labour in a way that allowed the rentier class to earn profits, the landowning class to earn profits without working themselves. Here's a graph which shows data on the number of slaves transported during the period we've been talking about. So the horizontal axis is the number of persons transported in thousands. So this would be like, for example, 4.5 million. During the whole of this period, 12 million slaves were transported from Africa to the New World. You can see that in the period up to 1700, there was some slavery, but it's the period after that in the 18th century where slavery really takes off, reaching a peak with this line showing the total amount of slaves being taken in the late 18th and early 19th century. You can also see the role of different countries in slavery here, so you can see English carriers being particularly important up to the end of the 18th century, after which slavery is abolished and English transport of slaves falls away, but Portugal sort of remaining important as a slave trading nation throughout this period. The practice of slavery obviously had a huge human cost on the population being transported. One way of seeing that is in these numbers. 43% of slaves from Africa were sent to the Caribbean in the period from 1500 to 1800. But if we look at all the African descendants of slaves in the New World in 1950, only 20% of them were in the Caribbean. That tells you about the death rate of slaves who were sent to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations. We know there was also a 15% death rate on voyages from Africa to the New World. We know there was a terrible disease environment in the places that slaves were being sent to that caused high death rates from disease. We also know that in production activities such as sugar, there was a high death rate and injury in production, and also huge maltreatment by owners. Not only did slavery have catastrophic effects on the population who were transported, it seems to have cast a long shadow as well. I've adapted this graph from research by Nathan Nunn of Harvard University on the long-term effects of African slavery. There are two lines here. The bottom line is for countries that I'm calling high slave countries. These are the 10 countries that had the most slaves transported during the period in which slavery was happening. The top line is for what I've called zero slave countries. These are the countries that had no slaves taken from them during the period in which slavery was happening. The vertical axis is GDP per capita expressed in 2005 dollars, and I'm looking at the period from 1970 to 2010. So we're looking at a period long after the institution of slavery from Africa to the New World finished. Yet we see that there's a large difference between GDP per capita in these two groups of countries. GDP per capita in the group of countries from which zero slaves were taken starts off about double of that in the countries from which slaves were taken, and over the period from 1970 through to 2010, whereas there's a large increase in GDP per capita in the countries where no slaves were taken from, GDP per capita remains relatively constant in the countries where slaves were taken from. This suggests that slavery may have had long-run effects on the level of economic development in the countries where it took place and didn't take place. One possible reason that Nathan Nunn has explored in his research is the idea that this is because of changed nature of trust due to the institution of slavery. So Nunn argues that where slaves were taken from, and this often involved one ethnic group taking members of another ethnic group to enslave them, that's created the basis for long-term low levels of trust. Whereas in areas where there were no slaves taken, there are much higher levels of trust. So to the extent that trust between peoples is an important basis for economic development, that could be one explanation for why we see this long-run difference between countries where slaves were taken from and countries where slaves weren't taken from. In the next section of this lecture, I'll be talking about the Enlightenment and the new science.